Good afternoon, everybody. Can you all hear me okay in the back? All good? Brilliant, thank you. I'm Dr. James Herrera Brooks, the Melanie Trent de Schutter Library Director here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and I'm of course delighted to welcome you to this noontime lecture in our Scholar Series. We wish to acknowledge the generous support of Comrade Mercer Hall, who has endowed this Scholar Series for us. Comrade serves as an honorary vice chair of the Board of Trustees of this institution and has been a champion of our work for decades. So we're very grateful for that support. We also wish to acknowledge the former VMHC President and CEO, Dr. Charles Bryan, whom this series also honors. So just before we start today, and you can stop listening to me and start listening to our speaker, I'm just going to run through a couple of upcoming events here at the VMHC. So coming up soon, if you're not aware of it, is our Comrade M. Hall Symposium for Virginia History. We did just say that he's been a champion of our work, and here he is again. So join us on September 7th for a day full of presentations, panels, and tours that highlight groundbreaking research into Virginia history around the theme of making and creation. This program will also include a very special keynote lecture by the esteemed Civil War historian Liz Varon, as she discusses how three Southerners remade regional identity in Reconstruction-era Virginia, which will draw heavily from her most recent award-winning book on James Longstreet. And our next noontime lecture will be on September 24th. We're going to meet here in the Robbins Forum for a lecture from Dr. Lindsay Chavinsky. She's the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library, and she's going to be talking on her latest book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. So now on to today's lecture, and if I could ask you all just to pause and make sure that any devices that might make noise are switched off, switched to Do Not Disturb, or switched to silent. And with that all done, we'll make a start on the introduction. Traditional narratives and myths of the American War for Independence highlight famous battles at Lexington and Concord, Brandywine, Germantown, Saratoga, and Monmouth. While these battles in the North were crucial, they did not lead to the ultimate surrender at Yorktown. In fact, it was in the 3+ years between Monmouth and Yorktown that the war was won. Today's riveting lecture, This Fierce People, will tell the story of these missing 3 years, often ignored by historians, and of the fierce battles fought in the South that made up the central theatre of military operations in the latter years of the Revolutionary War. Through the stories of a whole host of largely unsung characters, Black and white Americans, militiamen and irregulars, patriots and Tories, Frenchmen, the British, and Hessians, today's talk will reveal the misconceptions and contradictions of our accepted understanding of how the United States came to be, as well as the national narrative that American victory lay solely with General George Washington and his troops. So here today to tell this exceptional story is the esteemed historian, Alan Pell Crawford. Alan is the best-selling author of Unwise Passions, a true story of a remarkable woman and the first great scandal of 18th century America, as well as Twilight at Monticello, the final years of Thomas Jefferson. His writings have appeared in American History, The Washington Post, and The New York Times, and he is a regular book reviewer for The Wall Street Journal. His newest book and the subject of today's talk is, of course, This Fierce People, the untold story of America's Revolutionary War in the South. And of course, this book will be on sale in the museum shop after the talk and will be a wonderful way to begin gearing up for our marking of the 250th of the American Revolution, which will, of course, begin next year. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Alan Pell Crawford.
Thank you. It's nice to be back here. This is my at least third talk here through the years. And just as I'm walking out the door, my wife stopped me and she said, "You need to tell them this." And I said, "What?" She said, "That the real reason the American Revolution was won was due to Julia Child. After Saratoga, the French entered on the American side And it was through the diplomatic efforts of Julia Child that this was accomplished, because the French realized how much they would gain by the introduction of French cuisine into American kitchens. Now, if I had included that, I'd be selling a lot more books than I am. But I'm happy with the way things are going. I'm especially gratified by this comment posted on Facebook by one of my own nephews. He says, "I don't know who Alan Crawford is, but I'm really hoping this Southern perspective on the American Revolution is full of high-speed car chases and fun songs with catchy banjo licks, and at least a good barbecue recipe." He's from Philadelphia, by the way. I don't think he will be disappointed by this book, although I did neglect to chronicle the little-known Battle of Mayberry. So far, readers have been impressed by just how vicious the fighting was down here, and how it constituted what more than one reviewer has called our first Civil War. And there's a lot to that. The way supporters of independence and opponents of it tore each other apart during this period makes the Dukes of Hazzard look like, well, the Dukes of Hazzard. In December of 1780, just weeks after Nathanael Greene was made head of the Continental Army in the South, he told Sam, and he had come down to the Carolinas, he told Samuel Huntington, then president of the Continental Congress, that in the backcountry, he discovered to his dismay that supporters of independence and opponents of it, quote, pursue each other with as much relentless fury as beasts of prey. Men and boys who are not enlisted are frequently murdered as they ride along the road, and great numbers of Tories are waylaying the roads, waiting for unsuspecting victims to appear. Greene told Alexander Hamilton, then an aide-de-camp to George Washington, that the division among the people is much greater than I imagined. And the Whigs and Tories, by the way, the term patriots seems to have come into usage later. You almost never hear that term referred to. Supporters of independence tended to call themselves Whigs. He said that Whigs and Tories persecute each other with little less than savage fury. There is nothing but murders and devastations in every quarter. It was almost impossible to feed his army, Greene said, because the whole country is in a great degree laid waste, and the spirit of plundering made the challenge even worse. Civil government had almost completely broken down, and here I'm going to quote my own exquisite prose. The ravages of war were obvious almost everywhere you looked. Towns that had been bustling with business before the war had been reduced to smoking ruins. Bridges over the rivers that cut through the countryside had been demolished, preventing the armies from crossing from one side to another, but also made it impossible for fleeing civilians to do so. On farms, fences had been torn down to be used as firewood, and the horses, cattle, sheep, and hogs that they had once confined had been taken away by passing armies or slaughtered on the spot. Fields lay fallow and farms produced very little food. The owners whose farms still operated either found their corn, wheat, cattle, or hogs taken by passing troops or paid for with worthless promissory notes. On the big plantations, enslaved people who worked the fields had either gone over to the British or otherwise wandered off. Farmhouses, also commandeered by passing armies, had been plundered of their furnishings or sometimes burned, just as churches had been. Neighbors who had been friends and sometimes in-laws were now at war with one another. Widows and fatherless children wandered on country lanes, carrying their few belongings with them. Sickness and disease, rampant among soldiers and on prison ships, quickly spread to non-combatants. I meant to put an accent mark over that word, and I didn't. Commerce had come to a standstill. Inflation was rampant, and currencies had lost their value. The Continental Congress, what there was of national government, was effectively bankrupt, getting by on loans from France, as dependent on this foreign country for money as the army was for supplies. By 1779, Virginia was having a terrible time getting men to enlist because the state was running low on liquor. In an effort to save grain, the General Assembly cut the customary ration of a fourth of a pint of liquor per day to each man. Enlistments fell. Some armaments were being produced at ironworks, one here in Richmond, and carried by wagon into the Carolinas, but Benedict Arnold, when he captured this city in December of 1780, put a stop to much of that, destroying foundries, supply houses, and mills. Benedict Arnold, let's not forget, was an American. In significant ways, the war in the South was, as mentioned, a civil war. In 1778, when the war in the North had reached a stalemate, the British took the war to the South in the belief that the large number of loyalists in Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia would fight the war for them. And there was something to that strategy. At Kings Mountain in October 1780, the only man in the battle who was not an American was Patrick Ferguson, a Scotsman who commanded the troop of Tories. The Tories were fighting a makeshift force that called itself the Over Mountain Men. Men who had come from what is now Kentucky and Tennessee, crossed the Appalachians, whipped the Tories at Kings Mountain, and then went back home. Ferguson had told Lord Cornwallis that there was no way this swarm of backwoodsmen, as Bannister Tarleton described them, could beat him. But they did. Ferguson, who was killed at the battle, there's a monument to him at the military park at Kings Mountain, which is very much worth visiting. Ferguson discovered something that other British commanders would discover, and it made all the difference. As one British commander put it, and this one had the wonderfully posh name, I love this, John Watson Tadwell Watson. Watson Tadwell Watson said, "They will not fight like gentlemen. They fight like savages, eternally firing and whooping around us by night and day, waylaying and popping at us behind every tree." Now, a lot of this was new to me. I had seen History Channel reenactments. I had learned the standard narrative of the American Revolution, of what more than one historian has called George Washington's War. The more I learned, and when I decided to tell my agent that I was going to write this book, the less sense the standard story made. I had learned what most children are taught about the Revolutionary War. And it's a pretty straightforward story. It begins in December 1773 with the Boston Tea Party. Then there's Lexington and Concord. Then there's Bunker Hill. Then George Washington crosses the Delaware. Then there's Brandywine and Saratoga and Germantown, and then Valley Forge, and then Yorktown. What surprised me to learn that the last major battle in the North at Monmouth was fought in June of 1778. But the British did not surrender at Yorktown until October of 1781. Now, I have never been much good at math, but it seems to me that a lot of time passes between Monmouth and Yorktown, so something else must have gone on in those years that actually forced the British to surrender. I was also reading a good deal about George Washington at the time, and I realized that as monumental a figure as he was in the war, he was in the North the whole time only crossing the Potomac when Cornwallis had already taken his position at Yorktown, and the French admiral told Washington he couldn't keep his ships off the Virginia coast forever, and he needed to come south now. So the more I read about the war, the more obvious it became to me that the decisive battles were actually fought down here and not up north. And in almost all histories of the American Revolution, except for books for specialists, the Southern campaign is either totally overlooked or confined to one chapter toward the end. There are reasons that the Southern campaign is given this treatment or ignored altogether, and we can discuss that later if you want. But it's not only historically inaccurate, it also leaves out some of the great battles and great characters in the war. I got to love these battles and these characters, and I wanted to tell these stories. And I had to conclude that in one sense that it was not, after all, George Washington's war. But in another sense, it really was. While it is true that until Yorktown, Washington did not lead troops in the Southern campaign, he did something even more impressive than that, especially considering the apparent odds against an American victory over what was at the time the most powerful army in the world. It's tempting to draw some pretty simple-minded leadership lessons from Washington's conduct of the war. Tempting because there's so much explanatory power in them. Early in the war, Washington told John Hancock, who was at that time president of the Continental Congress, that for officers in the Continental Army, he wanted men much like Washington himself, who were well established and respected, prosperous, and as Washington put it, activated by principles of honor. Put differently, he wanted men who were already leaders in their community with reputations to uphold. Otherwise, he said, you will have little to expect of them. Washington had no faith at all in members of militia companies. He wanted professional soldiers, men who were well-trained and well-disciplined. He not only had no confidence in what we would call guerrilla fighters, men like Francis Marion, for example, he had disdain for them. As the war dragged on, however, Washington would come to rely on what we would call self-made men such as Nathaniel Greene, Daniel Morgan, and, yes, Francis Marion. He saw what they could do, and his understanding of leadership evolved. In October 1781, when he chose Greene to replace Horatio Gates as the commander of the Southern Army after Gates got annihilated at Camden, Washington was able to offer Greene little or no guidance on how to prosecute the war. In what, for me, was like the great moment of this whole book, Washington readily admitted that he had nothing to offer in that sense. Uninformed as I am of the enemy's force in that quarter, meaning the South, of our own or of the resources which it will be in our power to command for carrying on the war, Washington told Greene, I can give you no particular instructions, but must leave you to govern yourself entirely according to your own prudence and judgment and the circumstances in which you find yourself. Washington was well aware, he said, that the nature of the command will offer you embarrassments of a singular and complicated nature. But I rely upon your abilities and exertions for everything your means will enable you to effect. Washington would not presume in today's parlance to micromanage the war in the South. It would be up to Greene and his own officers and men like Morgan and Marion to figure out how to win the war in the South or not. If a strategy was to develop, they would have to determine what it would be and to give it form. Washington had the good sense, again drawing on the language of our day, to delegate authority when the situation required it. and Greene and Morgan and Marion and Light Horse Harry Lee and others accepted that challenge. All of which reminds me of the orders that Benjamin Cleveland, one of the commanders of North Carolina troops at Kings Mountain, gave his men. My brave fellows, he told his troops, we have beat the Tories and we can beat them again. They are all cowards. If they had the spirit of men, they would join their fellow citizens in supporting the independence of their country. Here's the key moment here. When you are engaged, you are not to wait for the command from me. I can show you by example how to fight. I can undertake no more. Every man must consider himself an officer and act from his own judgment, which is what Washington is telling Greene. Without pushing the point too far here, I would venture to say that there's something peculiarly American in what Washington and Benjamin Cleveland told their men, and in this own country, in our own country's understanding of leadership. It would be an exaggeration, of course, to argue that this understanding of leadership made it possible for supporters of the independence to win the war, but it's not a stretch to say it played a part. Because you see it over and over again in the war in the South, in which troops, sometimes with little training and sometimes no official connection whatever to the Continental Army itself, manage against horrendous odds to defeat larger and better equipped, better trained forces. Over and over, the supporters of independence, under the command of self-made men, managed to turn their weaknesses into strengths and to prevail. Maybe this was the result of some great insight on the part of the officers, or maybe it was just a recognition of reality, but in any case, it worked. I'm thinking here of Daniel Morgan in January 1781, when he faced Bannister Tarleton at Cowpens. Great numbers of Morgan's men had never faced enemy fire, or scarier still, they'd never faced British bayonets. So he devised a tactic in which he placed the least experienced men in a line in front of two other lines of battle-hardened troops. And the night before the battle, he went from campfire to campfire, telling these raw troops, some of them still in their teens, what would be expected of them come morning. They would take their position and Tarleton would charge, and they were to fire their weapons, and then they could file off the field. Tarleton would think they were fleeing, that he had routed the enemy, and charge ahead, not knowing he would be charging right into the guns of the second line. Excuse me. Long after I had laid down, one of the men recalled, Morgan was going out about among the soldiers, encouraging them and telling them that he was going to crack his whip over Tarleton in the morning as sure as they lived. But for that to happen, Morgan would count on them to do their part. And he would ask only what he knew they were capable of doing. They were not expected to hold their position at all costs. They were to stand their ground until the redcoats were within 50 paces of their line, then fire once, twice, ideally 3 times, and then fall back. Just hold up your heads, boys, Morgan would say. 3 fires and you are free. And when you return to your homes, how the old folks will bless you. And the girls will kiss you for your gallant conduct. Morning came, and as one of the soldiers recalled, Morgan's men came on like a thunderstorm. When they had come within 50 paces of Morgan's first line, he said it was pop, 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 and then the whole volley. It seemed like one sheet of flame from right to left. More redcoats fell than anyone could have imagined, and before long, once they had engaged with the second line, as well as those concealed in the woods behind, they immediately took themselves to flight, the soldier recalled, and they appeared to be as hard to stop as a drove of wild Choctaw steers. Cowpens, like King's Morgan, was a great victory for the supporters of independence, leading to victory ultimately at Yorktown. But here too, the story is messy. We like to think the war ended with Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown, but it didn't. The Civil War in the South continued for months, and the British did not leave Charleston until December of 1782, and New York until November of 1783, 2 years after Yorktown. And after the surrender, a loyalist named David Fanning achieved a dubious kind of notoriety by leading a murderous 10-month campaign, a small scourge, Fanning called it, against his North Carolina neighbors. Eventually, he fled to Nova Scotia, managing to escape punishment after being convicted of deliberate and willful murder, robbery, rape, and housebreaking. Fanning denied the rape charge, but in his defense, he claimed there never was a man that had been in arms on either side but what is guilty of some of the above-mentioned crimes. We like to think of the Revolutionary period and the founding of the new nation as a time when great patriotic leaders emerged, and that is true, they did. We're accustomed to look with a kind of awe at Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, for example, but their contemporaries did not. Henry and Jefferson were both regarded as disastrous wartime governors who failed miserably to protect Virginia from the enemy and adequately equip their own soldiers. The state was able to supply weapons for only 1 in 3 or 4 of its militiamen. And at one point in the war, Virginia refused to accept its own paper money for the payment of taxes. When Jefferson's term as governor ended, the legislature named Thomas Nelson to replace him. Nelson, who had been a major general earlier in the war. Nelson was a soldier, which Jefferson was not, and given near dictatorial power as governor, which Jefferson never wanted. Jefferson, having done as best he could under impossible circumstances, then packed his family off to Poplar Forest. His political enemies found his departure from Richmond and subsequent movements a rich source of satire. A sister-in-law, John Marshall's, could not contain her amusement. "Such terror and confusion you have no idea of," she wrote. "Governor, council, everybody scampering. Nothing is more laughable than the accounts we have of our illustrious governor, who they say neither took rest nor food for man or horse till he reached Monticello." This is unfair, but it gives you some sense of the irreverence with which Jefferson's contemporaries viewed his performance as wartime governor, and again helps us see that the period of our nation's founding with greater clarity. Jefferson's reputation has not improved in recent years, which brings us to the whole sorry subject of slavery and the role it played in the American Revolution, especially, of course, in the South. It's an endlessly rich subject, and it is getting a good deal of attention these days for understandable reasons. I mentioned earlier why the Southern campaign is given short shrift in standard accounts of the Revolution, and the fact that so many Southern commanders were themselves slaveholders is an important consideration in accounts of the war written in our time. But here, as in almost everything in life, irony abounds. How is it, Samuel Johnson asked at the start of the war, that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? And Johnson, to be fair, was referring in this instance not to Southern officers, but to Americans in general. Abigail Adams noticed this too, telling John, "It always seemed to me a most iniquitous scene to fight for ourselves for what we are robbing and plundering the Negroes of, who have as good a right to freedom as we have." Now, all of this seems pretty obvious to us today, but Edmund Burke, from whose speech on conciliation with the colonies my title is taken, saw something here that others of less penetrating intellect have failed to see. Burke noticed that what he called the spirit of liberty was greater in the South than in the North, precisely because of the institution of slavery. In Virginia and the Carolinas, Burke said, they have a vast multitude of slaves. Where this is the case in any part of the world, those who are free are by far the most proud and jealous of their freedom. Burke in no way intended, as he put it, to commend the superior morality of this sentiment, which has at least as much pride as virtue in it. But I cannot alter the nature of man. The fact is so, and that these people of the southern colonies have much more strongly and with a higher and stubborn spirit attached to liberty than those to the northward. In such a people, Burke said, the haughtiness of domination, combined with the spirit of freedom, fortifies it and renders it invincible. And invincible, as we have seen it proved to be. We can wish that the sources of this spirit of freedom were other than they were, but wishing will not make it so. The past is a different country, as L.P. Hartley wrote in his novel, The Go-Between. The past is a different country, he wrote. They do things differently there. And with that, I will be happy to entertain any questions. I live in dread fear of specialists. I have spoken to a room full of Jefferson scholars at Monticello, so I've seen it all. I can remember at one talk, after the talk, I went to each of the people who were most critical of me, and I said, you know, I appreciate the questions you raised. I want to know more. Let's set up a meeting. So then I went to the office of one of them, and she pushed a book across the desk, and she said, "You really should read this." And I said, "I have read it." She said, "You really should read it." So I'd be happy to take any questions. I hope there are some. Yes.
This is not related to the leadership you were talking about. Did the Southerners make use of ports in Florida? How big a handicap was not having access to ports and foreign trade?
He's asking about the access to foreign trade in the South, and especially Florida, I believe. I know nothing about Florida in the war. But yes, the ports were closed. The British held Charleston, at the time called Charlestown, which was a major problem. And so the shortages were rampant. Can shortages be rampant? Shortages were dire and serious. But they also became, it was interesting because they were also a problem for the British, because the British were 3,000 miles away from home. They were fighting wars in other parts of the world. And the Americans did hold some ports. And so once they would get material to America, they would have the Americans, Greene especially, understood that if he could drive them farther and farther into the backcountry, they would be farther and farther from their own depots and supply chains. And so what happened was called the War of Posts, in which commanders like Marion and Lee systematically took British forts along the rivers, which prevented the movement of material to the British soldiers. And in fact, Greene at one point led what was called the Race to the Dan, which he pursued. He allowed his army to be pursued all the way to Halifax County, Virginia, across the Dan River. And by that point, the British supplies were almost non-existent, and Greene and his men could be on the Virginia side of the Dan River, and rest and be reprovisioned. So supplies were, I probably haven't come close to answering your question, but supplies were a problem for both armies throughout.
What happened, Tories, after the war? How many left? How many stayed?
I don't know the figures, but a lot of them went back, as did people, enslaved people fleeing the plantations. They left and went to in some cases, to the Caribbean, but in most cases, as I understand it, to Canada. I wish I had the figures. I don't.
Hi, I understand that the British burned Norfolk at the beginning of the war, but I had read recently that the patriots, if you were the ones who actually burned Norfolk. Do you have a comment about that?
I don't know. I apologize for that as well.
I had read that the loyalists, it was a loyalist town, so they wanted to burn them out.
Well, it's a little like the burning of Richmond in the Civil War. It was Confederates that set fire to the area around Shockoe Slip and led to the departure there. Arnold burned and destroyed a good bit of Richmond, leading the government to flee to Charlottesville. And so there's this stuff is going on constantly. It's amazing the extent to which this had degenerated quickly into a terrible, terrible war. Not that any war is good. One of the challenges of writing this book, I have a cousin who's a Civil War historian in Lexington, Kentucky. And I called him once and I said, there's militia, there are regulars, there are Continentals, there are Hessians, there are British, then there are state troops of various kinds with different designations. And then there are guerrillas like Sumter and Marion and Pickens, who are really technically only vaguely associated with the Continental Army. So even keeping all that straight is extremely difficult. And I didn't think the general reader was going to care about whether or not this was the 49th North Carolina or the 39th. But again, it's a wholesale, Civil War. And so towns are getting burned. Historians will probably argue about who did some of this for years and years and years. But, Richmond gets burned. It's amazing. Individual houses. I think Marion's house was burned by the British at one point, or by the Tories.
Did the Native Americans help in the lower part? Native Americans or the Hessians that had deserted? Did they help with some of the?
The British were pretty determined to in a sense exploit the Native Americans to fight the not so Native Americans. That's mainly out in the western edges of the Carolinas and Virginia, and seems to have been more of an annoyance than a general strategic consideration. But a lot of what's going on is an annoyance, as Tadwell Watson said, that they won't fight like gentlemen, and the Americans had learned the Americans had learned a great deal about Indian fighting by fighting Indians. And what's fascinating too, and I spent some time several years ago at the Boston Athenaeum, which holds George Washington's own books. And I've got to go through them. And he had a couple of books that were British books for training British soldiers. And what was interesting there is that the British were not as robotic as they seem on History Channel reenactments, where they're marching into a line of men behind a stone fence and getting annihilated. They knew how to move in a group, which is essential, but they also were trained in what was called bushfighting. That was their term for it. And they were trained to, one soldier gets behind a tree and reloads while one's in front of the tree and fires, and then he pulls back. So the British are more sophisticated about this than we tend to give them credit for, I think. Again, the war is much more complicated than I certainly imagined. And it was a joy to be able to spend this much time puzzling over imponderables. You know, if you talk about how many soldiers fought at a given and how many casualties there were, historians will continue to debate these figures in perpetuity. So I encourage you all to read more.
I have two questions. The first one relates to Francis Marion and your comment about the guerrilla warfare. Is it myth or fact that Marion, before he would agree to go in to fight, because he had been active in the French and Indian War, he demanded that certain rules of conduct be established as the norm whenever anyone was taken prisoner. He did not want the butchery, as he called it, or what I've read about, to be, he didn't want to be part of perpetrating that, even though he did establish rules of conduct for.
Yeah, okay.
So that's my first question. Okay. So comment on that. The second one, I just want to make sure that I understand your main thesis, which you spoke to only in the last portion, and that was that the reason the South was so much more effective in fighting than the North was, you said you used two terms. They were free and they were in power in terms of the, I guess, the economy that existed in the South. Is that what you were trying to say?
No, I don't think so. So the first question was Marion and the treatment of prisoners and standards, general standards of conduct in the war, right? I can take one example that suggests that while I have not read this particular, what you're saying, I can give you one anecdote that suggests that you're right. It's at the, I think it's at Fort Mott, where Marion and Lee take the British position, and they take prisoners, and some prisoners are getting hanged, and Marion, or a representative, goes and stops this, and they say, well, General Lee told us that we could do this, and he says, Lee is not in charge here, I am, and this has to stop. So that supports the general idea that you're suggesting there. Well, I mean, Marion was not a systematic intellectual, and we don't have a lot of information about what he would have written on this, or, you know, I mean, their old camp is destroyed at one point, and all their whatever paperwork he had, which seems to have been minimal, but that suggests that he had a certain ethical approach to the whole problem. And he was kind of a straight-laced man. I mean, he was someone who had almost a puritanical sensibility. He never drank alcohol. He drank water mixed with vinegar. But he's a man of some kind of honor. Now, the other question was about the impulse toward freedom in the South that Burke notices. What Burke seems to be saying there is that where freedom has been denied to individuals, then the whole question, unlike in Massachusetts, for example, I'm guessing, the whole question is no longer an abstraction. It's a concrete daily reality. So if you live in a society in which these people are not free and these people have freedom, have power over them, the appetite to remain in power is greater. And one fascinating thing in the rhetoric of the revolution is how much North and South the terms of slavery appear. So the idea is that the British are trying to enslave us. And this was a stimulant to resistance to being enslaved. But it's especially intense in the South, where, as I said, it's not an abstraction. It's a concrete daily reality. And that is what Burke is saying is stimulating this intense desire for independence in the South.
But not amongst the blacks, amongst the whites.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about lines of communication, maybe from, say, Greene and Washington down to this amalgamation of patriot groups in the South. How did that occur, and did you find anything about how they accomplished that? It sounds like it must have been a challenge. And then
I'm amazed by that, because it's not something that the process is anybody seems to have written about. There may be a monograph somewhere, but I haven't seen it. Yeah, but the extent to which the letters are flying back and forth between Greene and Washington, or Greene and Morgan, and Washington and Morgan, and Sumter and Pickens and Lee, it's really remarkable, because it's a continued communication, and when it doesn't happen, these people are on their own. But again, Washington, I hope nothing I said about Washington and George Washington's war in any way is intended to diminish him. The fact that he tells Greene, I'm not going to tell you what to do, you got to figure this out, is to me an astounding moment. He says, this is a problem that I've got my hands full up here. I cannot presume to know what you're up against, but I've seen you in action and I trust you. And he had the same kind of thing with Morgan. It's fascinating. Morgan is practically illiterate. But Washington begins to see what Morgan can do. And he says, you know, this would be great. Why don't we equip a whole rifle corps and fight, let them fight in the Indian style, and even give them tomahawks. And so he's Washington, who starts out the war, as I said, wanting men like him who are educated and prosperous and respected and rich, well-born. And that's what he wants. And Philip Schuyler and others, I think, let him down. And Arnold certainly. And then he begins to see, no, there's ability in these other men, and we need to let them do what they're going to do. And then the letters that he does send, which you ask about, they have that flavor of saying, I trust you, figure it out, which to me is fascinating.
maybe just a secondary question. Any espionage, in order to prosecute a war, you have to have information on the enemy. Is there any information that the Whigs, Patriots had a system where they were gathering information from their Tory neighbors or on the armies and passing them on effectively? You read a little bit about that in the North.
It seems, yeah, it seems that there were networks in the North that I've never seen evidence of in the South. It's all episodic and circumstantial. at Kings Mountain. The locals tell the over mountain men where Ferguson's men are and how to spot him, and the locals are supplying in several cases. The locals are supplying, and then I'll finish with a very good example. The locals are supplying food to the British troops or the loyalist troops, and then reporting back to the Whigs. The example I would give, which may be a good wrap up of this, is a man named James Armistead. Armistead was an enslaved man in, I believe, Hanover County. Armistead was his owner's name. And Armistead, the enslaved man, ends up serving as some kind of aid domestic worker for Lafayette. But while he's working for Lafayette, he ends up infiltrating Cornwallis's camp on the way to Yorktown as a cook. And he's meanwhile gathering information on Cornwallis's army and reporting back to Lafayette. And supposedly at the surrender at Yorktown, Cornwallis sees him. And he says, well, you rascal, all this time you were working for the enemy. And after the war, Armistead appeals to the Virginia government, and with Lafayette's help is given a pension. And after that, then he calls himself James Lafayette.
That's going to be all we've got time for today. So just to remind you, Alan's going to be in Commonwealth Hall signing copies of his book, which is available in the gift shop. And he can also answer any other questions that you might have then. So thank you, everyone, for your support. Let's give Alan a round.